Welcome to part 4 of our Build a Design System series, where today we're going to look at the following components: our tabs, our button group, our pagination, our carousel, our anchor, our in-page nav, our navigation, our link, and then our breadcrumb. Be sure to subscribe. We have lots more components on the way when it comes to building out your design system. And I would just also like to call out that now on uicollective.co, as you may have seen, the community is answering any design question you might have. So if you have a design question, leave it on our community forum and we'll be sure to respond. And we also did just launch our beta of our assessments today. So if you have an interview coming up, you can go ahead on our platform and take a mock interview with simulating some of the questions that you might get. We have lots more on the way, including design challenges and more, so be sure to check that out, and let's dive right into the episode.
All right, let's go ahead and build out our tab items that are going to go into our tab bar themselves. So let's start off adding some text to the canvas. Let's call this our tab item. Make sure that's set to our body medium, and we're going to go with our body, our text body for that color. What we're going to go ahead and do is actually just add in some icons here. So let's go with look in our central icon system, and maybe we'll just go and add in I don't know, like a heart or something. Heart's always pretty popular, so add one on both sides. All right, then let's go ahead and add those in an auto layout wrapper. Let's set this to hug and hug for now, and now let's go ahead and adjust some of our auto layout. Now, you can have different sizes for your tab items, whether you want like maybe a small tab bar or a large tab bar. We'll only be working with one size today. So as we're going through and adjust our auto layout, keep that in mind. This is just how we're going to be building our tab item. If you want to make the horizontal padding, 12 instead of that 16 that we're going to set, in order to give yourself a little bit of a different look and feel for your tab items, feel free to go ahead and do so. We're also going to set our vertical then to tab as well. Just make sure that's center aligned. And I think we're looking pretty good here. Now let's go ahead and actually just set our icons here to our icon primary for now. Let's call this our tab item, and let's go ahead and create the component of this. There we go. We're actually going to call this our dot tab item, because again, when we have that period at the front, that's not going to be published because we want to bring in our tab bar component and not our tab item components. Okay, so there we have that all set up for now. So let's bring back in a symbol for testing. And now let's go ahead and add some of the properties. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to add here is let's add in a property here, a text property for our text itself in order to easily change that label. So let's call this our label. And now when I hit on that symbol, I can adjust this tab item itself. All right, so now let's go ahead and work on our icon lefts and our icon left and our icon rights. So it's going to be very similar to what we did in the past, starting with our layer property for icon left. And then we're going to go ahead and add in an instant swap for that icon left, because you can't have two properties with the same name. We like to have that downward arrow. So let me add in that downward arrow, icon left. There we go. And now let's do the same for icon right. So layer property for icon right. And let's also add in that instant swap as well for our icon right. There we go for that icon right. Awesome. So now I can see here that on our symbol, I can adjust the label. I can turn on and off that icon left and that icon right, and also easily adjust those items or those icons as well. Okay, so we have our initial tab item. Now let's go ahead and start looking at adding our variants. Now that we have our tab item, let's go ahead and add some variants for our tab item. So we're going to start off with, so it's going to be a very similar structure to what we have done in the past. We're going to start off with our default, our hover, our focus, and our disabled here. So this here is going to be our status, that first property. This will be our default with the lowercase d. And then our second variant here is going to be our hover. So for our hover, we're going to go ahead and add a fill, because again, our original tab item does not have a fill itself, and you'll see why a little bit later on. And we're going to set this to our surface action hover 2, our icon primary to our icon action hover, and then our text body to our text action hover, just like that. Next, let's go ahead and add in our focus. So if you've watched any of our other videos by now, you should be pretty familiar with a focus component. So it's going to have a stroke, no fill. We're going to apply a variable here for the width, which is going to be set to 2 on the outside. This color is going to become our border focus. And we're going to apply a variable here with the radius is set to 4. Now, one thing you're probably realizing or asking is, why are we setting a radius of 4 at the focus, but not at the individual tab item level itself. I mean, you can. There's nothing wrong with setting a radius at the individual tab item itself. But if we paste this in and use the absolute positioning tool, is when the focus state would be active, you wouldn't really see that radius anyway, because there's no fill with that individual tab item itself. So it's not something you would really need to worry about. If you want to add it for your hover, feel free to go ahead and do so, but we're not going to be taking that approach right now. And again, in line with some of our other videos, we like to have it 2 pixels on either side. So 1, 2, 1, 2. Where is it here? 1, 2. And bring this one down. 1, 2, 1, 2. And of course, I think that's right. So let's go ahead then and set this to left and right and top and bottom. So as this label expands or grows larger or shrinks, that focus will also shrink or expand with it, and it doesn't stay fixed. So that's why it's really important to set your constraints. So there we have that focus, and then I think we're in some pretty good shape. Lastly, let's go ahead and adjust our disabled. So when it comes to our disabled, we're simply going to set our icon primary to our icon on disabled, and then our text body to our text disabled. And then there we have our disabled status for our text items. Okay, so we now have our initial set of variants for our tab items. Now let's go ahead and look at adding some state variants. Okay, so let's now look at our state variants for our tab item. Before we do that, there's a couple things I want to simply adjust here. For our default, I'm actually going to set the icon primary to our icon action, and also do the same for our focus as well, because they share the same characteristics. So our icon primary is going to become our icon action. And you're going to see why we're doing that a little bit later on. So apologies for that mistake. But that's the beauty of design systems. Make mistakes and fix them as you go. So let's go ahead and add in another variant here, which is going to be our state variant. And the first one is going to be our unselected. So all of these variants here is if our tab item is not selected. Okay, so now what we're going to do is really just copy all of these down. And these are going to be our selected variants. So not a ton of changes are going to come into play here. But what one thing we're going to do for each of them is actually set the body medium to the body medium semi-bold, again, just to add a little bit of differentiation. What we're also going to do with all of them is add a stroke on the bottom, which is going to be 4 pixels on the inside. And to start off, this is going to be our border action. There we go. So this is what that tab item would look like if selected. So very similar with our hover, so our body medium to our medium semi-bold. Let's then add a stroke on the inside, which is going to be set to 4, the border width of 4, just on the bottom, and this is going to be set to our border action hover. Same thing that we did with our default for our focus. So this is going to become our body medium semi-bold. Let's then go ahead and add in a stroke, which is going to be on the bottom. Apply the variable border width of 4 pixels, and then this is going to be our border action. Let's then do the same thing with our disabled. So this is going to become our body medium semi-bold, and let's add a border stroke, so a border on the bottom, radius of 4, or width of 4, excuse me. I don't know if I can type. Width of 4 on the inside, and this is going to become our border disabled. There we go. So let's go through and to check this out now. And of course, Figma decided to rearrange our properties. Let's go ahead and simply adjust this. So our icon left with our icon left, our icon right with our icon right. Let's maybe move that label up as well. Okay, so one thing I see I have the option to do is swap between all of our different statuses and also change the state as well, and even adjust the label and adjust our icons as well. Beautiful. So we have all of our tab item variants now. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and look at piecing together our tab bar. Now that we have our tab items, let's go ahead and build out our tab bar. Now, one thing you're probably realizing is where did my icon right go? It's still there. I just hid it in the layers, so it's just hidden by default. Again, that's just personal preference for me. That's not something that you necessarily need to do. Okay, so let's take a copy of our tab item, add another, add some auto layout between them, and adjust the gap of those to 12. Let's go ahead and copy and paste it 7 times. 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And let's call this our tab bar, and then create the component of this. Now, you're probably thinking it's perfect. Looks like a pretty reasonable tab bar. Now, the issue with this is let's move this up, our symbol up, and maybe let's add a quick frame here. Imagine this is in a UI, right? So let's make actually, I'm going to go ahead and make the page background to black, and we'll get in a dark mode a little bit later on. But imagine this is in a UI, and maybe this last one here, this is selected. I don't really know if all of these tab items, button-looking items are connected. Are they a part of one component? Are they separate components? What's the purpose of them? And because we're really missing that underlying line that kind of brings our tab together to let the user know that, this is a tab bar component. These are individual tab items that I can click, and they're associated with each other in some way. So we're actually missing this underlying bar here that we call an HR or keyline, which is its own separate component. So in theory, we have our tab bar. Let me switch back to light mode here. So in theory, we have our tab bar, but what we actually need to do is create a new component called our HR or keyline, and then place this inside of our tab bar to add that unifying look and feel to it. So sure, we have our tab bar, but we still need to add in our HR or our keyline, which is going to be a net new component that we're going to build right now. Okay, so let's build out our keyline now, or HR or keyline, and then go back to our tab bar and then complete our tab bar. So your keyline is definitely the easiest component that you're ever going to build because it really is just a line. So it's going to set this to our border primary. We're going to apply a variable with the width here set to 1 for now. Let's go ahead, call this our keyline or HR, and let's go ahead, create the component of this. There we go. So we have our keyline, and then that's really it. But we're going to add some variants here to start. So we're going to add a small, medium, and then large. So this is going to be our size. This first one here, because it's 1 pixel, is going to be our small. This one here will be our medium. And then this one here is going to go ahead and be our large. And so with the medium, we're going to change simply the border width from 1 to 2. And then for our large, we're simply going to go ahead and change the width from 1 to 4. There we go. So we have a small, medium, and large keyline set to our border primary. So small, medium, and large. And that's really that simple. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and bring in our keyline component and integrate it into our tab bar component to create that unifying effect. Sweet. So with our keyline built out, let's jump back to our tab bar here and search for our keyline in our components. This can be local components, not our central icon system. So let's bring in that keyline component and then simply just paste that into the tab bar itself. Now, that, of course, is not right. So what we need to do then is actually group all of our tabs in their own auto layout container. So let's add an auto layout container with the tabs, and let's simply call that to our tabs. Then let's go ahead at the main component level itself and simply adjust the auto layout because we want that tab bar to be at the bottom, just like that. As I can see, that works. And let's go ahead and simply adjust to remove that gap all entirely so that keyline is nice and snug with the rest of our components. Now, one thing that you're probably thinking about is the keyline does not extend the full width of the tab bar. And that's because what we want to do is we need to go ahead and set that to fill container. So when I bring down a symbol for testing, I can see that as we extend out that tab bar, that keyline falls with it, but our tab items stay in the same place. So that works as intended. Beautiful. So let's go ahead now and add in some properties here for our nested instances. So let's go ahead and turn on all these tab items. I'm not going to add nested instances for the keyline because, again, in terms of consistency, you don't really want your designers adjusting the width of that keyline from small to medium or medium to large or small to large. Then you might have tab bars that sort of have a little bit of an inconsistent look or feel, particularly towards that keyline. So that's why we're leaving that off for now. So it's really important in your documentation to let your designers know not to adjust your keyline in their components. So now I can go ahead and adjust, and yep, so our properties did not move. So let's maybe set this one to our default, and let's maybe set our second to our selected to make it look a little bit real life. And there we go. I think now we have a pretty good looking tab bar component. And one thing you can also do real quick is just by default is maybe you only really want to show 3 tab items for now. you have that option to do so. So if you're a designer who comes in and they search for their tab bar, they don't have 7, because again, that is a little bit of a unique use case to have 7 tab items in your tab bar. So maybe you only want to start off with 3. So you can simply just hide the extra tab items in your layers. Let's now go ahead and start looking at building out our button group. But to start, as we did with a lot of our other components, we're going to need to start with our button group items themselves. So let's maybe just enter in some text here. Let's call this button group. Let's set this to our body medium to start. We can always change it a little bit later on. And then let's go with our text action. Okay, so let me just condense that. Maybe just center this. And then I'm just going to go ahead and bring in just one icon. So maybe we're just going to bring in a heart icon if my Figma decides to load. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bring in just one of these heart icons right here. Let's go ahead and set this to our icon action. Let's select both and then go ahead and add some auto layout. So very similar to what we did with our last component where we were looking at our tabs. And let's adjust some of the auto layout here. So we're going to have a gap of 8, horizontal padding of 16, and a vertical padding, let's say, of 8. Again, we can always come back and change that a little bit later on. Let's make sure this is set to hug and hug. Let's call this our dot item, because again, our dot item will not be published with the rest of our design system. We're only going to publish our button group component. So let's go ahead then and create the component of this. There we go. And I think we're in some pretty good shape here. One thing I did forget to do, however, is I forgot to add a stroke. So I'm only going to add a stroke on the right-hand side here. It's going to be, let me move this up. It's going to be 1 pixel. Border width is going to be that small, so 1 pixel, and this is going to be set to our border action. There we go. So just 1 pixel on the outside. And there we go. I think we have our button group item, but don't forget to go ahead and add your properties now. So starting off with a text property for the label. So now I can easily go ahead and adjust this text. If I change button group to just button, I can see that adjusts nicely. And then also layer property for icon left. Again, if you want to add in an icon right, you can go ahead and do so. But when it comes to my button groups, I only like to use an icon left. So starting off with the layer property for that icon left. And then, of course, we're going to need an instant swap property as well for this icon left. There we go. Let me go ahead and add in that instant swap, or that downward arrow, because then we can't have 2 properties with the same name. There we go. So I have our label, our icon left, and then I can swap that icon out as well. So there we go. We have our first button group item. Next, let's go ahead and look at our variants. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at adding some of our statuses. Let's go ahead and add a variant. And again, this would be pretty similar to what some of the other components that we've worked on in the past are like. We're going to have our default, our hover, our selected, and then also a disabled as well. Let me move these over just to give ourselves a little bit more space. Awesome. So for our hover, we're going to go ahead and add a fill here, and this is going to be our surface action hover 2. Our text action will be our text action hover. Our icon action will become our icon action hover, and then our border action will become our border action hover. So really, really that simple. Next, what we're going to do is let's bring in another one of our defaults for our selected. Oh, but first, don't forget to name your properties. So this is going to be our status. This is going to be our defaults. And name our variant, sorry, not our properties. This will be our hover. And then this here will be our selected. So for selected, we're really just going to inverse everything. So let's go ahead, add a fill. And this is going to be our surface action. Then let's change our text to our text on action. And then this to our icon on action. And there we go. It's really that simple. No other changes are required for the selected. So it's really just inversing the default. Then let's go ahead and let's take a look at our disabled. So for disabled, let's go ahead, add a fill. This is going to be our surface disabled. Let's change the text action to our text disabled, our icon action to our icon on disabled, and then our border action to our border disabled. And there we go. There we have the disabled variant. So really, really nice and simple. And that caps it off for our button group items. Now let's go ahead and look at piecing together our button group. So now that we have our button group items, let's now look at piecing together our button group. So what I'm going to do here is, so very similar to what we did with our tab component, just bring 2 instances down, and simply just what we're going to do is just drop the gap in between them. Because again, we want them to be close together, like basically touching essentially. And because we have that 1 pixel border on the right-hand side of our item components, it creates that degree of separation. So what we're going to do is very, very similar to what we did with the tabs. Let's just maybe add 7 or so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, just like that. Let's call this our button group. And now let's make some adjustments. So the first thing that I notice here is that none of our items have a corner radius with it. And the reason being is because we want the corner radius to be at the overall component level. We don't necessarily want them at the individual item level. And we'll look at a quick example of that, because we have a radius here, let's say of 4. All of a sudden you kind of get this weird look with it. You know, you have that border on the right, which is nice and straight, but then all of a sudden you have a rounded corner on an item that's selected, and you want to really avoid that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a stroke on the outside, and we're going to apply the variable. So this is going to be our small, and we're going to set that border to our border action. Then what we're going to do is apply the radius. Let me move it over here. We're going to apply the radius at the overall frame level itself. So let's apply a radius of 4. And what that's actually going to do here is, if I go into my layers as an example, is if I hide that first button group, I can see that first button group item, I can see that the radius is always consistent with it. So that radius is always going to be there. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the component of this. And let's go ahead and actually just turn on all of our different properties for our button group items. So add those nested instances. There we go. So we have our initial button group component here. Let me just go ahead and hide some of these, just as an example. So maybe you just have 3 to start, and then let's make this third one selected. There we go. So maybe you have your initial button group component here to start, but there's actually different types of button groups that you might want to offer, either as their own components or as variants of your main components. Let's go ahead and take a look at that next. Okay, so we have our basic button group component here. Now let's look at creating some variants and some modifications associated with our button group. Now, one thing I would just like to fix right off the bat is that one thing I didn't do is I didn't clip content, our overall parent frame, which would allow this border to sort of extend beyond the edge. So what I'm going to do is just select our parent frame there and simply just turn clip content on, and that's going to clean that up. So apologies that I missed that right from the get-go. So on our main component here, I'm going to go ahead and add a variance. Now, one variant that I always like to add is a toggle. So if you only have 2 options to toggle between, this comes in handy if you're working with charts and you're working with graphs and other larger data components. So with this, what I'm going to do is simply just hide all the items except for the last 2. Let's go ahead and call this property to type. Our first here is going to be our default. And then this one here is going to be a toggle. Now, what that allows the designer to do is when they land on a default, instead of having to go into their layers and hide the items to get to 2, they can simply just select toggle, and it just streamlines your design teams or designers' workflow when working with button groups. So that's always one variant that I like to add. And one thing we didn't also do or also think about is, what if I don't want a label associated with any of my button group items? Maybe if I just want the icons. So we're also now going to go back to our button group items and introduce the option in order to have button group icons, more or less. So let's go back into our button group items here, and let's look at our properties. So let me bring down one of these. So I can see that our properties got a little messed up, so let's go ahead and clean that up. Okay, so I can see right away on one of these, I have the option to adjust the label, but I don't have the option to actually hide the label itself. So let's go ahead and actually reintroduce that. So let's go ahead and first off call this our label with a downward facing arrow, because again, we can't have 2 properties with the same name, because our property that just has the label will be that layer property itself. So let's go ahead and create that. So let's create a property, layer property that we're going to call label. Let's do the same for all of these. You can also use the multi-select option as well. Label, and then label. And let's go ahead and adjust here. So we have our label. Actually, we'll put label first above our icon. So now I have the option to hide that label as a whole. Again, you can also hide that icon left and that label, but again, just be sure to have some pretty rigid documentation letting users know that you can either hide a label or you can hide an icon left. You cannot have both of these hidden at the exact same time. So now let's go into our variants here. Let's create a new variant, and let's maybe just show 3 for now. Oops, with this one here, not the other one. So let's maybe just show 3 for now. And what we're going to do with each of these is actually just hide that label altogether. There we go. And what you can do with all of them actually is let's go ahead and just across all of these is just hide the label, hide the label, hide the label, and then maybe just show, 3 of these, and this is going to be our icon type. So now, if you're a designer and you pull in your button group component, you can easily select a button group toggle or your button group icon as well. And there you go. There you have your button group component. Let's go ahead now and start building out our pagination component. But as we did with a lot of our other components, we need to start with our pagination items. So let's go in and just pull in a chevron from the central icon system here. And I'm going to go ahead and add some auto layout right away. And I can see when it did that, because it added that horizontal padding of 10 and that vertical padding of 10, it created the width and height of 44. 44 is generally what I like to have my pagination items, believe it or not. But I actually always like to have my pagination items fixed because I don't want them to change sizes at all. I always want them to be that nice, crisp square. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 44 by 44. Let's go ahead and align that in the center to keep that icon nice and centered. Let's call that our dot item because, again, when a designer or when our design system is published and our designer is pulling in the pagination component, we don't want them to pull in the pagination item as a whole. So by adding a period at the beginning, it's going to stop this component here from being published. So our designers will only be able to pull in that pagination component as a whole. Okay, so let's create the component then, and let's go ahead and apply some colors here. So we're going to go ahead with a surface primary, and let's also, not a stroke. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but then let's adjust the color of that icon to our icon action. There we go. So we now have our initial pagination item, and what we're going to look at next is adding a bunch of different variants. So with our pagination item now built, let's start by looking at building out our status variant. So I'm going to go ahead and add a variant here. And one thing I did forget to do is I forgot to apply that radius. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that radius of 4 to start. And sorry, it might be a little bit difficult to see with the white backgrounds. There we go. Hopefully that makes things a little bit easier. Okay, so let's start off with our status variants. This here is going to be our default, and be sure to make that lowercase, that D lowercase in default just to be consistent. And we're going to start off with our hover. Okay, so let's just do some positioning here. And there's going to be a bunch of different type variants that we're actually going to look at next. But again, always get the foundations with your status variants. So there we have our default. Now let's look at our hover. Okay, so with our hover, we're going to change our surface primary to our surface action hover 2. Let's maybe go ahead and add a stroke this time. So 1 pixel on the inside. Let's go ahead and our border width, let's maybe set that to 1. Then we're going to set that to our border action hover. And then let's change our icon action to our icon action hover. There we go. So there we have our hover. Let's then go ahead and look at our focus next. So if you've watched any of the other parts of the series by now, you'll know what we like to do with our focus components. Let's go ahead and add a stroke, set this to our width here to 2 pixels on the outside. Let's apply that focus, that border focus, and then drop the fill. And then let's go ahead and apply a radius of 4 here. There we go. So let's be sure to call this our focus and our layers. Sometimes I do forget to do that, so my apologies if I forgot to do that in the past. But then let's simply copy and paste that focus element on the inside. Now, of course, when we do that, this, of course, is not right. So let's use our absolute positioning tool to simply try to get it 2 pixels on either side. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 1, 2. Be sure to set those constraints to left and right and top and bottom. And then there we have our focus component. Okay, so our focus variant. So we have our focus. Next, let's go ahead and look at our disabled. So with our disabled, let's go ahead and set that fill to surface disabled. And let's change the icon from our icon action to our icon on disabled. So there we have all of our different initial status variants. We're not done with our variants yet, as we still need to look at our overflow variants, our previous variants, our numeric variants, and also our selected variant types as well. And we're going to look at those next. So now let's look at some of our type variants here. So in terms of our first set of variants, this here is going to be our next variant, because if you think about pagination, if you have the arrow going right, you can always assume that this is what's going to take you to that next page. So this is going to be what we're going to call our next variant type. So let's go ahead and add a new variant here that we're going to call type, with that first value being next. There we go. So if I bring this down, I can see that we have that type variant of next. Okay, so then what's the opposite of next? Oops, that is not what I wanted to do. What's the opposite of next? Our opposite of next is our previous type variant. So this is going to be our previous. And what we're really just going to do is simply just bring these down here and then just swap out our chevron right for our chevron left small. There we go. So across all of our different components here, chevron left small, chevron left small, and then our chevron left small. And personally, I see that our elements have this little bit of a radius to it. Maybe our icons here, now that I'm seeing it, is a little bit too square edged. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a radius here to all of our components. Again, using the central icon system, it makes things nice and easy in order to add some different radiuses here. There we go. I think that, oops, I didn't use the multi-select. Now let's set these to 2, and there we go. I think we're looking really good. And then these here are all going to be our previous. So let's select these and call these our previous type. Our previous type. So now if I copy an instance, I can see I have next and then previous as well. Okay, and then we also need to look at our overflow. So when it comes to our overflow, let me just try to bring you a quick example here. So this is our previous, this is our next. Maybe you might have value 1, and you have like some overflow values in between. So there's a larger gap in between. It's not as simple as going next and previous. So let's look at our overflow values next. If that's confusing, sorry, I don't think I explained that too well. So you might just have to wait and see what I mean. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is go into our central icon system and look for our dots. So we use that dot grid 1x3. So let's search for this one. So our dot grid 1x3, set that radius to 2, and then this would be an example of our overflow. So hopefully you've seen that before in terms of like your pagination, where you might have like this dot overflow next to some of the values. So let's go ahead and replace all of these out with that dot. Dot grid 1x3, that dot grid 1x3, and also that dot grid 1x3. There we go. And then these are all going to be our overflow types. If I can spell that right. There we go. So these are all of our overflow types. If I go ahead and bring in an instance here for testing, I now have my overflow, I now have my previous, and I now have my next. But we're not done quite yet, as we still need to look at our numeric and our selected, and that's what we're going to take a look at next. So with our next, previous, and overflow variants out of the way, let's now look at our numeric and then also as our selected. So with our numeric, what we're going to do is simply just bring down one of these values, and these are going to be our numeric values. And what we're going to do for each of these is just copy a number in, just make that nice and easy for now. Let's simply copy in a value. Let's delete that icon itself, and then set the value of that text element to hug, and then hug. So let's go ahead and apply a quick style here. Let's maybe go with our body large. I think our body large works pretty good, but you can also do it the body medium as well. Let's check that out. So our body medium. I think body medium is probably better in line with some of the overall size. I'm going to leave at our body medium, and then let's simply just adjust here. So let's adjust the color to our text action. So maybe that's a little bit too light. So maybe we go with our body medium semi-bold, and I think that's a little bit better. Okay, so there we have our numeric. So that's just how we're going to adjust our component here in order to get that numeric value. Now, one thing as well that you're going to want to do is you're always going to want not a layer property, but a text property, so you can easily adjust a number. So whether it's page 1, 2, 3, or 4, think about Google. So I'm going to go ahead and add a quick text property that we're just going to call label. And now when I bring in this copy for testing, so I got some default conflicting properties here. So let's go ahead and call these our numeric. There we go. So I can see this is our numeric, and now I can adjust this to 2 or 3 or whatever it is that I want to adjust that with. So let's go in and copy, take that same approach here, and paste that in, delete our other icon, change this to our text action hover for our numeric. Let's do copy the number from our default and paste this in to our focus, because again, these are going to have the same styles. And then for our disabled, copy in, delete the icon, and this will become our text. Let's go with our on disabled. There we go. So there we have all of our different numeric values for our pagination item variants. But again, we're not done quite yet, as we still do need to look at our selected variants, and that's what we're going to take a look at next. So the last variant we're going to have for our pagination item components here is going to be our selected variant. So if one of these values is selected, if you think about Google, if you're on page 1, what does that look like? Now, for your selected variant, we're only going to have a selected numeric variant. We're not going to have a selected for overflow, for previous, or next, because you're never actually on your next variant. Once you hit next, you go to a page, so you're always going to be on a numeric value. You're never going to be stuck on a previous or next page. It's just a button that you click in order to get to a new page. So that's why we're only going to be working with a selected variant for our numerics and not anything else. So let's go ahead and make this our selected type variant. And now let's simply go ahead and adjust. So for our surface primary, we're going to change this to our surface action. And then our text action is going to become our text on action. For our hover itself, we're going to do a little bit of inverse here. So our surface action hover 2 is going to become our surface action hover. So again, just a slight difference in shade there between the purples. And then our text action hover is going to become our text on action. For our focus itself, so very similar to what we did with our default, this here is going to become our surface action. And then our text action is going to become our text on action. And then for our disabled, let's go ahead and change surface disabled to disabled selected. And then our text on disabled is going to become our text on action. So then if I go ahead and pull in any of these values here, and maybe I select that type to be selected, notice how it automatically defaults to the numeric value. So you have an unselected numeric value, then you have a selected numeric value as well. And again, if you have any comments on that, be sure just to ask on our community forum, and I'll be sure to get back to you right away. Beautiful. So now that we have our pagination item, let's now go ahead and start looking at piecing together a pagination component. Okay, now let's go ahead and start looking at piecing together a pagination component. So there's a couple different components that we can, or versions of pagination components that we can start off with. And the first that we're going to build is that what we like to call a jumper component. So I'm actually going to give ourselves some more space here. So let's say we have our right, our left, so our next and our previous, and then we might have some numbers in between. So let's make these our numeric, and we're just going to group these in an auto layout to start. Maybe just adjust the gap here to 8. Let's go ahead and simply, add in a bunch of them for now. Let's say this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. Oops, I did that wrong. This is 3, this is 4, this is 5, this is 6, and then let's say this is 7. And what we can go ahead and do is we can just call this our pagination. And then let's just simply just go in, and maybe we just want to hide some of these for now. So maybe we only have 3 to start. I think that is looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and create the component of this. One thing you don't want to forget to do is add some of your nested instances as well. Again, for pagination, because there can be a lot of items, it's optional really, but something I always like to do just for best practice. And then there's something else that we can also add on to this jumper pagination. So one thing I always like to do as well is also give the option to sort of include like results per page. So let's go ahead and set this to our body medium, our text body. And then let's go ahead and bring down a drop down. Again, this is really our drop down component. So this is really just to show you how you can sort of play around, have some fun with your pagination component a bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hide that hint copy, and I don't have the option to hide the label for now. I might need to go back and add that to the base component. So I'm just going to hide that label in our layers for now, and then I'm also going to go ahead and hide that icon left. And let's simply just adjust and maybe set the placeholder here to 12. So let's shrink this down, group these in an auto layout. Let's set this to hug and hug. And let's set the gap maybe to something like 12. And what we're going to call this is our results. And what we can actually do then is we can really just copy and paste this into the pagination component itself. Or you can extend this out. And maybe you want something that you might want to do here is we think about, an overall frame itself. Or sorry, let me just give you a little bit of a better example here. I'm going to delete this. Is if I bring in this pagination component, maybe you might want, your pagination on your left, and the results per page on the right, offer some flexibility. So something what you can do is you can actually group all of your items inside of their own frame. So if we're going to add an auto layout frame here, I'm going to call this our pagination items. And then what we have here is our results. So you can then on your pagination items, you can set this to fill. And you can see that it sort of pushes and adjusts the position of your results. Again, something too, you're not going to always have that results per page. But what you can do then is you can go ahead and add a layer property and just set this to results. So then on your symbol of your component, you can see you can hide those results. You might just need to go back in then and really just adjust sort of that the horizontal or horizontal resizing. So in this case, you might want to set this back to hug if that's hidden. So again, just some options here on how you can go ahead and customize your pagination component a little bit. And I'm just going to go ahead and hide that results by default for now. Okay, sweet. So now that we have our initial pagination component, let's look at a different type of variant associated with our pagination. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at adding a variant to our pagination component. So the first variant that we built, I always like to call the jumper, and it's always usually a little bit easier to build, which is why I built it first. But then you also have a default variant. So this here is going to be our default, and then this here is going to be our jumper. So again, just the reason why I built our jumper first is it's usually a little bit easier for you to build. So when it comes to your item here, so we have our jumper, we have our default. Let's go ahead and what we're going to do is let's re-show all of our different items as well. And for some reason, I see that 3 of our items here have got absolute position. So let's go ahead and simply just adjust that. There we go. So let's re-hide that. Give ourselves plenty of space to work with here. And let's just really just delete these 3. Let's leave the arrows at the end. Oh, that one's locked for whatever reason. And we're going to delete all the numbers on the inside. So very similar to what we did when we were building that little results widget right here, is we're almost going to recreate that, but almost where you're selecting what page you want to be on. So you can actually enter in a number like 11. So let's go ahead and let's just bring in our field component. Our field, let's hide that icon left, let's hide that icon right, and just shrink this down and maybe set the placeholder to something like, 2. Then let's go ahead and add some text on the side, of 12 pages. Let's go ahead. So it was body medium. It's fine for now. Let's set the text to our text body. And let's simply add some auto layout between them. Make some adjustments. Set these to hug and hug. And maybe just adjust this to something like 12. Again, doesn't really matter. You can keep that consistent with the results if you'd like. And let's call this our page selection. So let's then go ahead and copy our page selection and then paste it on the inside of our pagination items within this default variant. So move that to the side. So here you can see that you're almost like I'll have the ability to actually type out the page that you want to be on. So you can just set this to fixed. So maybe it's our 55 works just fine. So you have the option to actually select, or type in a value of 2 of 12 pages or 3 of 12 pages if you want to jump. Or you can also use the arrows as well. So this is another type of variant associated with your pagination component. Again, we like to call this our default, or at least I do at least. And again, the reason why I built our jumper first over our default is generally just our jumper is just easier to build right off the bat. So oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So let's go ahead and have a quick test here. So you can choose between the type, whether it's a default or your jumper. And maybe we'll just put our default ahead of our jumper, again, just to be consistent. And you can also show and hide those results as well. And again, if you put that into your component, you might need to adjust some of those resizing properties, whether it's set to fill or hug, to achieve the design that you're looking for. Beautiful. So there we have our completed pagination component. Now let's go ahead and start looking at building out our carousel component. So this is going to be pretty similar in terms of structure as to how we've built a lot of our other components in the past. I'm going to go ahead here and search for a chevron. If this will decide to load, there we go. So let's bring in doesn't really matter. This one works just fine for now. So just a chevron right. I'm going to go ahead and add some auto layout to it. So I'm simply going to press Shift and then A. Now, this is where you can really exercise some control in terms of how large you want your individual carousel arrow. If you want it a little bit larger, if you want it a little bit smaller, this is where you can adjust that padding and that gap, just the padding accordingly. So maybe we're just going to add a quick fill just so you can see the change. So if you want your carousel to be a little bit larger, maybe you can set that to something like 20 and 20, or if you want it to be much smaller, you can set that to 5 and 5, and even just or even just remove the padding in on itself. So this is where you can sort of exercise some control over how big you want your carousel arrow. But for us, let's maybe just go 12 and then 12 for now. Keep it nice and big for now. And let's go ahead and make some adjustments here. So I'm going to go ahead, add a stroke. I'm also going to add a radius here to start off with. Add in a round radius, and hopefully this looks a little bit more realistic already. On our border, I'm actually going to set it to 2 pixels. On the inside, it's just fine. So let's look for our border width. Set that to 2. And let's go with our border. Let's go with our border action. And then let's, with the color of our icon, let's look for our icon action. And let's change the color of our fill to our surface primary. There we go. Let's go ahead and let's call this our carousel arrow. Let's go ahead and create the component of this. Copy a symbol for testing. And then there we have our initial carousel arrow component. So before we get to elements like the scroll bar, let's go ahead and add some variants to our carousel arrow first. Now let's go ahead and add some variants to our arrow that we just created. Let's go ahead, add a variant here, move our instance out of the way, and let's just structure these and position these just a little bit better. Okay, so the first one that we're going to work with here is our hover. So we already have our defaults, but first off, let's be sure to change the name here. So this is going to be property 1 will be our status default. And then this one here will be our hover. So with our hover, let's change our surface primary to our surface action hover 2. Let's change the color of that border to our border action hover, and then the color of the icon inside to our icon action hover. There we go. So we already have our hover, the variant. Then let's go ahead and work with a focus component. So let's go ahead, let's call this focus. And if you've watched any of the other elements in this series by now, you'll know exactly what we're going to do. Next is let's add in our radius here, round, and just make this a circle, so 80 by 80. Let's go ahead, add a stroke, drop the fill. That's going to be our border width of 2. Our medium on the outside, and we're going to set that to our border focus. There we go. So let's copy our circle and then paste it inside of our focus variant, and then use the absolute positioning tool to just position it 2 pixels really on either side. So shrink this all the way down. This is where the fun part comes in, a little bit tricky, finicky, play around with it, just try to get it as close to as possible. So 1, 2, 1, 2, I think that's looking half decent, and maybe a slightly smaller here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and 1, 2, and I think that's good enough for now. So let's go ahead and set the constraints there to left and right, and top and bottom. So now on the instance that we have here, we can go ahead and test this out. So we have our status of default, we have our hover, and then we also have our focus as well. So we're not done just yet with our arrow. So before we move on to our scroll bar, let's go ahead and look at our type variants. So when it comes to your type variants here, you probably already guessed this by now, but because if our arrow is facing right now, we're going to need an arrow left. So those are going to be the different types of type variants that we have, both a right and a left. So this is going to be type. And again, because our first arrow is facing right, we're going to go ahead and set the value to right. So then on our instance here, I can see that this value is right. So what we're going to do then is really just, let's not do that. So let's go ahead and just copy each of these down, and then let's assign these the value of left, and let's simply go ahead and just swap out that chevron right for a chevron left. Chevron left, there we go. So our chevron left, and then our chevron left. So it really is that simple. And maybe one thing as well that I'm just going to go ahead and do is just using the central icon system here and our multi-select, maybe just change the radius to 2, 2 or 3, kind of like 2, just to keep it a little bit rounded. Because again, maybe I think this arrow is just a little bit too sharp. So I like to have my arrows a little bit rounded here as soon as I adjust the radius on each of those to 2. Awesome. So there we have our arrow component. Next, let's go ahead and look at our scroll bar component before we piece together our arrow and our scroll bar into our carousel. All right, now let's go ahead and build out our scroll bar for our carousel. So what we're going to do to start is actually just bring in a line here. We're going to set the width of this line, our border width. We're going to set that to 2 pixels, and then set the stroke here on the inside. And we're just going to make these rounded on either side. We're going to go ahead and call this or change the color or the variable of this to our border primary. And we're going to call this our scroll area. Scroll area. Now what I'm going to do is just simply copy and paste that. And we're going to call this our scroll control. And then let's just position this somewhere on the inside. Again, if you're prototyping and you want your carousel for it to come to life, you can go ahead and use your variables to do a lot of cool things when it comes to prototyping itself. We're not going to get into that right now. What this is really just meant to show developers what this component would look like and how it might work. So we're going to go ahead and set the color of our scroll control to our border action. And then let's go ahead and add these in a frame that we are going to call our scroll bar. There we go. Let's go ahead and create the component of this, copy down an instance for testing, and there we have our initial scroll bar component. But we're not done just yet. Let's go ahead and look at adding some variants to our scroll bar. We have our scroll bar component. Let's go ahead and add some variants here. So our first variant here is going to be our default, and this here is going to be our hover. So very similar to what we did in the past. So this is default, and then this is going to be our hover. So when it comes to your hover, just some minor changes here. We're going to change the color of the border action to the border action hover. And we're going to go ahead and select both the scroll area and the scroll control and simply just change the border width to 4. So it's a little bit larger. And then there we have our hover. Let's go ahead and just move these up. And then for our focus, let's go ahead and copy our default and then bring this all the way down. And then, so very similar to what we did with all of our other focus component or variants in the past, is we're going to add an outer perimeter, but it's only going to apply to the scroll control area itself. So let's go ahead, add a stroke, drop the fill, add the radius to round, outside, border width of 2 pixels, and let's change this to our border focus. There we go. And then let's collapse this all the way down and simply just copy, delete, and then paste into that focus variant. Be sure to change the rectangle to focus as well. And let's try to get it to 2 pixels on either side. So 1, 2, 1, 2. And then 1, 2. And be sure to set those constraints to left and right, top and bottom. And there we go. There we have our scroll bar components. Oops, let's be sure to grab everything all at once. Move these down. So before we go ahead and piece together our arrow and our carousel, let's do some light testing specifically for the scroll bar. Let's just do some real quick testing with our scroll bar now. So let's bring in that component that we just built here. And let's do some light testing. So let's say if we try to extend this out to the right here, look what happens is that our scroll bar doesn't actually follow with it. And our scroll control just stays the exact same. So let's go into our layers here for the default to start, and let's select that scroll area. And what's one thing that we notice? That our constraints are wrong. If we set those constraints to left and right, notice how all of a sudden that scroll area takes the width of that container. So there we have our scroll, where is it here? Our scroll area. And then let's look at our scroll control. And one thing we want to do as well is we kind of want it to scale accordingly. So we're just going to go ahead and set the constraints to scale and then scale. So as I extend it out, notice how our scroll control area actually gets a little bit bigger. Sorry, I should probably zoom in here. our scroll control actually gets a little bit bigger and smaller as I adjust the size. So really important when you're building out your scroll bar to always check your constraints and how your components actually interact with each other. So let's go ahead and just adjust, do the same for our hover and our focus. This will be left and right. And then our scroll control will be scale and scale. There we go. And then for our focus, our scroll area, is that way? Yeah, so left and right, and our scroll control, scale and scale. And then let's set that focus so left and right and top and bottom. So now let's go ahead and just do some checks here. And that is not right, of course. Let's go ahead and look what happens. The reason being is just because I extended the frame outwards that way. So be sure not to do that. Always extend it so it's always going the same way. And there we go. So there we have our default hover and focus component. And we can see that we've tested those components, and now we see that those are also responsive. So we've got our arrow, we've got our scroll bar. Now let's go ahead and use both these components to piece together our carousel. So let's bring in 2 arrows here. So we're going to have a left, then of course we're going to have our right. And let's go ahead and then bring in that scroll bar component. So then let's move one on either side, add some auto layout here, and let's go ahead and adjust. So let's go ahead and set the width to hug, and then let's move our carousel to the right, and then let's maybe just set the gap to something like 16 or 20, whatever works for you. Let's go ahead and call this our carousel. Hopefully I didn't spell that wrong. Let's go ahead, create the component of this, copy a symbol for testing, and now let's do some testing here. So I can see here that our carousel is not expanding with it. So let's go ahead as I adjust the width, so let's go ahead with on the main component, check out our scroll bar here. If we set that to fill, there we go. I can see that our scroll bar then is responsive. And because we used our constraints properly when building out that scroll bar, I can see that our scroll control also shrinks or expands as that instance width adjusts with it. So I can tell that we did that right. So we're not done just yet. Let's go ahead and be sure to add in our nested instances for our arrow, our scroll bar, and our other arrow. So then when I hit an instance once, we have all those great properties that we can go ahead and adjust. And there we go. Now you have your completed scroll bar component. Let's go ahead and start looking at our anchor, what you might call an in-page navigation, in-page nav. So let's start off and look at building out our anchor items to start. So we go ahead, add some text to the canvas here, and let's just call it our anchor item. Let's just adjust some of this here so it sits in the center. Let's set this to our body medium and set the color to our text body. Oops, I did not add that right. So our body medium and then our text body. There we go. Now I can see that those are applied. Let's go ahead and also add in some icons here. So let's maybe just go into their central icon system and add in just a gear. Or maybe what's a better example? Maybe just a home. Home. There we go. A home. And then let's maybe add in like a gear or something. I don't know. Doesn't really matter too much. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead, set the color variables here. So this is going to be our icon primary for now. Let's go ahead, add some auto layout, and let's maybe set the gap of that to 12. And then let's adjust some of the padding. So first off, let's see what's up here. So let's set this to hug and hug. There we go. And now let's go ahead and adjust. So maybe if you want 8 horizontal padding and 8 vertical padding. Again, you can. It's really up to you how small or how large you want your paddings to be. We're going to keep it at 8 by 8 for now, but you can go ahead and adjust that a little bit later on. Let's go ahead and call this our dot items, because again, when you publish your design system, you don't want your designers to be able to pull in the anchor items to use. You want them to pull in a completed anchor item component or the completed in-page nav component. So putting a dot or a period in the front of this component name will stop it from being published. So I'm going to go ahead and create the component of this now. And one thing we still need to do is let's go ahead and add a stroke. So this is going to be on the left-hand side. 1 pixel on the inside is just fine. And let's set this to our border primary. There we go. So we're not done just yet. Let's go ahead and maybe just make our radiuses here a little 2 pixels. Again, just to keep it consistent. I like them a little bit rounder. There we go. But one thing we still need to do is we need to go ahead and add in some of our properties now. So let's start off here with a text property. So let's call this our label. So then on our instance here, if I was to adjust the text, I can see that that adjusts accordingly. And then we need to add both layer properties and instance swaps for the icons as well. So this is going to be our icon left. There we go. And then let's go ahead and add in the instance swap for icon left. Be sure to always add that downward facing arrow. There we go for icon left. Oh, that did not render in. Let's do that again. Oops. There we go. Our arrow. Go on. Why is that not working? Let's try this one more time. Edit, emojis and symbols. And let's add that downward arrow. There we go. Now we're cooking. Okay, so we have our icon left that we can hide and also swap out that icon as well. And let's do the same for our icon right. And you can also call these pre and post icons as well. I know that's pretty popular, but I just use icon left and icon right. So this will be our icon right. There we go. Edit, emojis and symbols. Where's that downward facing arrow again? There we go. So then I can see here on our symbol that we can adjust the text we already did. We can hide that icon left, and we can also hide that icon right and instant swap those out. And okay, I think we're looking pretty good. So we have our first anchor item here. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and start looking at some of our variants, particularly for our level 1 and also our level 2. And if that doesn't make much sense, bear with us as we'll get to that very shortly. Sweet. So now that we have our base anchor item component, let's now start looking at adding some variants here. So let's go ahead, add a variant to start, move down our symbol here, and let's just give ourselves some breathing room. So this here is going to be our default. Of course, we always like to start off with our status variants, and this will be default, but be sure to make that D lowercase. And then let's work on our hover here. So let's go ahead and move this up. So with our hover itself, I'm sure you probably guessed it. Let's go ahead and add a fill, and this will be our surface action hover 2. Our icon primary is going to be our icon action hover. Our text body is going to become our text action hover, and our border primary is going to become our border action hover. So really, really that simple, something that we've done all the time so far. Then let's go ahead and look at our focus components. And any guesses with the focus component is you got it. We're going to add a 2-pixel border on the outside here. So this is going to be a stroke. And this is the beauty about design systems is a lot of the same principles that we applied to one component can be used on all the other components as well. Let's go ahead, add a radius of 4, drop that fill, and let's go ahead and set this to our border focus. All right, so let's go ahead and simply copy paste it in and use our absolute positioning tool to get it roughly around 2 pixels on either side. One thing I love about Figma is they do have that little border, little dashed border, so you can see what's up. 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 2 pixels. Okay, so 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 2 pixels, and 2 pixels. And let's be sure to set that to our left and right and our top and bottom. And be sure to always rename your rectangle to focus, which is something I forget to do all the time. We can go ahead and delete that now. And let's be sure that we set our constraints. Okay, so we did left and right, top and bottom. Okay, so we have our default, we have our hover, we have our focus. Next, what we're going to do is look at the selected variants. And these here are actually going to be our level 1s. So a sneak preview here into some of our different items as well. So we're going to call these our level 1. And then we're going to look at the selected variant for our level 1s. Selected. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and look at that next. All right, now let's go ahead and look at adding some type variants. So let's go ahead, add a new variant here that we're going to call type with our starting value going to be unselected. So let's go ahead and simply, I can see that our properties got all messed up here. So let's go ahead and readjust these. Icon left, icon right, labeled. There we go. So what we're going to do then is simply just copy each of our level 1 variants, and these are going to become our selected. So with our selected, not a ton of changes are going to occur. One of the most notable changes is that for each of these, it's going to become our body medium semi-bold. body medium, semi-bold. We can kind of do the changes step bulk here. We don't need to do it one at a time. So our body medium, semi-bold. And then what we're going to do is also adjust some of the colors, particularly for the default in the focus as well. So we can adjust both of these at the same time. So with the stroke, our border primary is going to become our border action. There we go. And then our icon primary is going to become our icon action. And our text body is going to become our text action. So it's just a little bit of a darker shade, or a little bit of a color change there. And one thing we're also going to do is go ahead and apply the variable here, border width. And one thing I noticed, I'll go back and adjust that. So we're going to set that to 2 pixels instead of 1. And let's go ahead and actually apply that border width variable of 1, something we didn't do before. Again, just to keep things nice and consistent. Next, what we're going to do is make some similar adjustments here to the hover. So the colors are all really going to stay the same for hover. The other larger change is really just going to be adjusting the width to 2, and none of the other colors are going to stay the same, or none of the other colors are going to change. And of course, we already changed our body medium to our body medium semi-bold. So these are all of our selected values for what will be our level 1 variant. So we have our status, default hover focus, and we can change whether it's selected or unselected. So these are all of our level 1s. Next, what we're going to do is look at our level 2s and add a new variant for that. Next, let's look at our level variants for items. Let's go ahead and add a new variant here that we're going to call level, with the first one being 01. And if you're not too sure what your levels are, it'll make a little bit more sense once we start actually piecing together our anchor component. So what we're going to do is really just copy and paste all of our anchor items that we built at the 01 level. These are all going to be set. We can do that at bulk to the 02. And the only real difference between our 01s and our 02s is we're actually just going to increase the horizontal padding only on the left-hand side to either 16 or 24. I always like to do it 16, but when you piece together your anchor component and you want a little bit more space on the left-hand side, you can go back and adjust. So that's really the only difference between our 01s and our 02s. And again, if that does not make sense, it will once we piece together our anchor component. So please bear with us here. So now let's go ahead and look at our variants. So I can see that we have our level 01, we have our level 02, we have icon left, icon right. We can change the type, whether it's unselected or selected. And we also can change the status as well. So now that we have all of our anchor items built out, let's go ahead and piece together our anchor component. So now that we have all of our anchor items, let's go ahead and piece together our anchor component. So let's go ahead and hide that icon left, icon right by default, and then let's simply go ahead and stack these. So but first, let's add some auto layouts. So zero gap, 0 padding. Let's go ahead and call this our anchor, and then let's maybe add just 7. 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And let's go ahead and create the component of this and maybe hide a couple at the parent by default. So again, the reason why we do this is because it's always good to exercise some type of control around how many anchor items you want in an overall anchor component, so you don't end up having an anchor component that has like 50 different anchor items in it, because that's just way too much. And if you need to hide or show some, you can just do that at the layer level itself, hiding specific items or re-showing some of those items. So let's go ahead and also add in our nested instances here for each of our different anchor items. There we go. And let's now take a quick look at an example here between a level 1 and a level 2. So I'm going to go ahead here and let's be sure to set this to hug. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and just change the icon here to a chevron. You know, where's our small chevron? No, down small. There we go. So imagine you have an in-page navigation. You almost have different layers or nav elements inside of one other navigation. So let's go ahead and just change this to our level 2, and maybe this also to our level 2. And let's change this to our selected. So in this case here, you know, what you might have, or this would probably be a chevron up at this point. So let me go ahead and just adjust that. There we go. So what you might have is if this is something like, you know, your settings, this might be, you know, billing. This might be, what's a good example? Notifications. So it's different layers of navigation inside a parent navigation component. So your level 2s would be inside of your level 1 components. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we structured the component the way that we have. And I can see here that now we have our completed anchor item our completed anchor component, excuse me. And again, sometimes your anchor can be a little bit of a confusing component. So if you do have any questions on that, be sure to ask on our forum. I do read and respond to every single question. So next we're going to go ahead and do is look at our navigation component now that we have our anchor component all built out. Now let's look at an overall site navigation. Now we're only going to cover this at a very high level. There's a lot of things that you can do with your site navigation to really spruce it up. But we're not going to get too deep into some of the more complex designs. We're really just going to show you how to set the foundations here. We'll let you take it from there. So we're going to start off with our body medium and set this to our text body. And then let's go ahead and add in just a chevron. A chevron, there we go. It's maybe a chevron down. And this is just personal preference, but I only really like to have a chevron with my navigation items, or only have an icon of my navigation items on the right-hand side. You can also have an icon on the left-hand side, but per se, it's not something I usually do. Just personal, really design preference at that point. So that's why we're only going to have a nav item with an icon right, and you'll see why I chose a chevron a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and make some adjustments here. So let's set this to hug, and maybe just go ahead and set this to 12 or 8, doesn't really matter. And then let's make some adjustments. So let's set a horizontal padding of 8, a vertical padding of also 8. I think that's more than fine. Let's go ahead, create the component of this. But first we need to name it. So again, we're going to call this our dot items, because when we publish our design system, we want to pull in the navigation component as a whole and not these individual components. And using that period at the start will stop them from being published. So let's go ahead and change the color of our icon here to our icon primary. And let's, of course, go ahead now and add in some properties. So starting off with a text property for our label, I can see it's nav item. So if this is something like home, I can see that that's going to adjust. And one thing too, you can also add a layer property for that chevron right. So let's go, or for our icon. So we're just going to call it icon because we're only going to have one icon. And this is where is really up to you in terms of how you want to structure out your navigation items. If you want some flexibility into adjusting the icons themselves, you can go ahead and add in an instant swap. I'm not going to do that because personally, I only like to have an icon if it's a chevron, because it would specify that there's a menu component that follows with it. So that's why I'm using the chevron. And again, if that doesn't make sense, that'll make sense very shortly. But again, if you want to offer a flexibility to change these icons, maybe include like a home icon, you can go ahead and add in both an icon left and instant swaps as well, but we're not going to do that for now. So we have our initial menu item component. Next, let's go ahead and look at adding a variant. Next, let's go ahead and look at adding some variants here. So we're going to have a status variant, which is going to be our variant to start the name of our property. And then we're going to have a default. So then we're going to have a hover as well. So with our hover, very similar principles to what we've done in the past. So it's going to add in a surface action. Or actually, maybe we won't add in a fill. Let's just change the text to our text action hover, and then our icon to our icon action hover. There we go. And then for our focus, I'm sure you guessed it by now. What we're going to do here is add in a focus. And there's some debate as to whether or not navigation or header navigation should have a focus status or not. We're going to include it just in case you want to, which is going to be that border width of 2, border focus, and let's drop the fill. Let's go ahead, copy, delete, and then paste on the outside and make sure that's 2 pixels on either side. There we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 1, 2. Set those constraints left and right, top and bottom, and let's add a little bit of a corner radius, maybe something of 4. I think that's fine. And be sure to call that focus as well in your layers. And then your selected. So this is where we're not diving too deep into different variant types here, because if you have a chevron it's selected, you would want a menu to, of course, show with that. So that's where we're going to leave it to up to you to use your creativity as to how you want to build those drop down menus. Maybe your navigation item So very similar to what we did with level 1 and level 2. Maybe you might have a navigation item that doesn't have any icons attached to it at all. And then maybe you have a navigation item that do have those icons attached to it, so that you can go ahead and add in some of those different menu components. We're not diving too deep into the specifics of doing that today. We're going to leave that for you. We're just going to show you how to set the foundations. So let's change our icon here to our icon action, and then our text action. There we go. And let's go ahead and simply just maybe hide all those icons by default. So we have our default, we have our hover, we have our focus, and then we have our selected item as well. Okay, so now that we have those out of the way, let's go ahead. Let me just double check something here. Perfect, I named all those right. Now let's go ahead and start piecing together our header navigation. Now let's just go ahead and piece together our navigation as a whole. So take a copy of your logo. Ideally, you do have your logo as a component itself. And one thing you'll probably notice here is, Kirk, why are your variables not applied? It's because when I copied the logo into this file, the variables didn't come with it. So cut me some slack. So let's go ahead then and bring in some of these nav items here. And let's just copy these and maybe just set the gap to something like 8 and add 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And we're going to call these our list. This is our list. Then let's go ahead, select our logo, select our list, add some auto layout here. Maybe we'll just set that to something like 24. Let's go ahead and create the component of this. First, let's call this our header navigation. There we go. And now let's go ahead and make some adjustments. So very similar to what we did in the past, is you're not always going to want to show all 7 of your menu items to start. So what we're going to go ahead and do is really just maybe condense it to 4 for now. And maybe just to make this seem a little bit more real life, I would first go ahead and actually add in those nested instances here. Turn these on. There we go. So maybe if we go copy an instance here, there we go. So maybe we have something like, this is our home, this is our about us, maybe this is our team, and then maybe the answer, form or something here. So we have sort of this basic header navigation as well, but this is where you can really decide to spruce things up if you would like to. So let's go ahead and maybe just add in a button component here. From our local components or button component that we built a little bit earlier on. Let's go ahead and just hide the icons here. To start. And maybe, you might have sign up, and then you might also have login, and your login might be the more transparent version. So let's go ahead and group these, and you might call these your actions. And let's simply paste these in here. And it might look a little bit wonky just because our sizing is a little bit off, but that's okay. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is maybe just adjust here. So I can see that that doesn't scale accordingly. And let's go ahead then and set our list to fill. So this is where you can start to add in a whole bunch of different, what am I looking for? Different versions of your header navigation, both at the desktop level and also at the mobile level as well. So if you were to add different variants here, this is where you can really start to define what those would look like. But again, each and every navigation is specific to the individual brand. So what we're really just trying to show you here is how to set up your header navigation component, and we're going to let you do the rest. So hopefully that makes a whole lot of sense as to why, or as to how you can also go ahead, how you can piece together your header navigation. Be sure to add your nested instances for those buttons as well. And there we go. There we have an initial header navigation component. All right, let's go ahead and build out our link component, which is probably the easiest component that you'll ever build when you're building out a design system. So we're going to set this to body medium, then our text action. Let's go ahead and also bring in some icons here. So maybe we'll go with an arrow. Again, it doesn't really matter what we choose, and maybe like a link, an external link icon, external link, something like that. All right, let's go ahead, set these both to 2, and then actually I kind of like this one a little bit better now that I'm seeing it. Sorry, this is me just being picky. 2 and 2, and let's set these to our icon action. There we go. So let's then select all of our elements here, add some auto layout, and let's adjust. So let's set this to hug and hug. For whatever reason, this has got absolute positioned, and let's adjust that gap. Let's go ahead and call this our link components. Just align that in the center. Let's create the component of this, and there we go. Copy a symbol for testing. Now let's go ahead and add in some properties. So what we're going to do is add in, of course, that text property to start for that label. Oops. Yep, that was right. Sorry. This will be our label. So now I can go ahead and adjust this for, like something like learn more. And now let's add our properties for our icons. So starting off with a layer property for our icon left, and then also an instant swap for our icon left. Arrow. There we go. And let's do the same for icon right. So layer property for icon right, and also an instant swap for icon right. This is going to be an arrow, of course. Can't have two properties the same name. So now I can see we can adjust our label. We have our icon left and we have our icon right as well. So now that we have our basic link component out of the way, let's go ahead and look at our variants. So now let's go ahead and build out our variants here. So let's go ahead, add a variant, and let's give ourselves plenty of room to work with here. One thing I should probably go ahead and do is just bring in some of our tags here. And again, I am using a pre-existing tag, of course, and we'll learn to build these tags in the next episode. So be sure to drop a subscription or a subscribe for that. So we have our default here, we have our hover, and then we have our focus. And then we also need one for our disabled. Sorry, I should have set that up before. Bear with me. Okay, so for our hover here, one thing we're going to actually go ahead and do is going to make some very small adjustments here. Let's go ahead and add in a fill, and this is going to be our surface action hover 2, and I think that's fine. Let's go ahead and adjust these to our icon action hover, and then our text action hover. And maybe now that I'm seeing it, maybe we do want to add, let's test this out here real quick. Maybe if we just add a 2, just gives ourselves a little bit more breathing room. No, it's okay. We'll leave it at 0 for now. So there's our hover. And then let's go ahead and add in focus. Oops, and I didn't name our properties yet. So this is going to be our status. This first one here is our default. Be sure to make that D lowercase. And then we have our hover, and then also our focus. And of course, I'm sure hopefully you know the drill by now, that your focus is just 2 pixels on the outside. Apply a variable width 2 on the outside, border focus. Apply the radius of 4, and let's drop that fill. And then let's simply go ahead and adjust or paste on the outside. There we go. So use our absolute positioning and get that 2 pixels on the outside. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 1, 2. Be sure to set those constraints to left and right, top and bottom, and let's call this our focus. There we go. So we have our focus, and let's also look at our disabled. And maybe one thing I want to do at each of the component levels as well is maybe just add even just a brief radius. There we go, just to keep things consistent. And let's also do it here as well. So a radius 4, and let's go ahead and have our disabled. So with our disabled, we're going to add a fill, which is going to be our surface disabled. Our text action is going to become our text on disabled, and then our icon action is going to become our icon on disabled. So there we have our disabled link. So, oops, and of course, Figma decided to mess with our properties here. So icon left, icon right, and icon right. There we go. And there we have our first set of variants for our link. And next we're going to go ahead and do is actually look at our inline variant. So we're not done with our variants yet. Let's go ahead and add another variant that we're going to call type, with the first value just going to be our basic link. So let's go ahead. This is going to be our basic. And then let's have also an inline variant as well. So with your inline, it's really just the same. So I'm just going to copy all of these down. The only real difference is what we're going to do is instead of it being our body medium, it's going to become our body medium link. So it's going to be that underline. Body medium link, and then our body medium link. There we go. And these here are going to be our inline. There we go. So then I can simply swap between our types, so our basic, and then our inline as well. If you also want to get into size variants, it's not something we're going to look at today. What you would really do here is these might be your medium size. And then one thing you can also do is if you want to have a smaller link size as well, you can simply just go ahead and add in, and change everything to small. And that will give you different sizes of your link component itself for all these different use cases, whether it's a card, or whatever, or whether it's the links in a table, whether it's in a card. You might want to have different sizes of links depending on that individual use case. We're not going to get into that, but if you do want to add size variants as well, it's really as simple as just simply swapping or changing the size of your icons and your text as well. Awesome. So there we have our completed link component. So again, we have our status, we have our types, we have our label, icon left, icon, and our icon right. And I can see here if I bring out an instance, we can change between all these properties as well. Okay, awesome. So we have our link component. Let's now go ahead and build out our breadcrumb component. All right, so let's go ahead and build out our breadcrumb component, leveraging our link component that we just built. So I'm going to go ahead, hide that icon left, and change that icon right to a chevron. And let's simply go ahead, just copy and paste that once. Maybe set the gap here to 4, and just copy and paste this 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. Then what we're going to do is at the end, we're going to just call this current page. There we go. And set that to our body medium and our text body. There we go. Let's then go ahead, just add some auto layout here and get rid of all of our padding. And we're going to call this our current page. And then we're going to call this our link structure. There we go. Then what we're going to do is select our current page and our link structure, add some auto layout, and set the gap here to 4. So the exact same gap that's within our link structure. And then we're going to call this our breadcrumb component. There we go. Let's create the component of this, bring down a symbol for testing. Now let's go ahead and add in some properties. So the first property that we're going to want to add here is a text property, or first off, a layer property for the current page. So we're going to call this current page, because depending on how your guidelines work, maybe your page itself, you might have like a title beneath it, so you don't really need the name of the page itself. It could just be personal preference as well. So we can hide that current page if we want to, and we also want the option to add a text property to that current page as well. So add a text property for current page label. Actually, let's call this label. There we go. Sorry, let me double check something here. There we go. We're actually going to go, instead of label, we're going to call this our current page as well. So we select the main. We're all going to call this our current page. Again, just best practices. That should have been current page to begin with because they are the exact same components. So my apologies there. So our downward facing arrow. There we go. So now I can see I can turn on and off that current page and also adjust the name of that current page to something like, about us with ease. Let's also go ahead and add in some nested instances. Oops, pressed that wrong. Let's add in some nested instances for our links. There we go. And maybe we just want to also hide some of the links that are link structured by default. So you only have 3 as a basis to start. And maybe to make things a little bit more realistic here, maybe we want to change this to home. Add an icon left to the start. And let's bring in that home icon. There we go. So that's how you can sort of leverage your link to build out a nice realistic breadcrumb component complete with all of your different properties that we built in addition to the current page as well. And there we go. There you have your breadcrumb component.